Raise your hand if you're ready for 30 minutes filled with success stories and hope. Today I talked to Dr. Liz Hillard with the Wildlands Network about the Pigeon River Gorge I-40 corridor. You'll learn how groups like Wildlands are teaming up with state and federal departments of transportation to redesign bridges and other barriers to accommodate wildlife based on extensive data collected on wildlife movements and impediments over the years. So stay tuned. Relief from today's depressing headlines is on the way. You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. The Rewilding Earth podcast is supported by businesses such as Patagonia, Catula, and Biohabitats, as well as the Whedon Foundation and listeners like you. If you love the work that the Rewilding Institute is doing, please consider donating at rewilding.org. And be sure to sign up for our weekly newsletter while you're there. Dr. Liz Hillard is a Senior Wildlife Biologist for Wildlands Network and helped lead and manage the study design, implementation, analysis, and report writing for road ecology research focused on the important Pigeon River Gorge Interstate 40 corridor near Great Smoky Mountain National Park in North Carolina and Tennessee. She also works to build partnerships and engage the public in wildlife habitat connectivity and conservation efforts throughout the southern and central Appalachian region. Liz currently serves on the board and as the secretary for North Carolina chapter of the Wildlife Society.
We all know, and we've been hearing, because it is out in the news now, the detrimental effects of roads on wildlife. And while, tens of millions of birds, reptiles, amphibians, and mammals are killed per year on roads in the United States, this wildlife mortality from roads, or what we call roadkill, is just one part of the issue. So roads cause habitat fragmentation and can hinder the movement, behavior of wildlife, such as dispersal and migration, and more generally disrupt wildlife movement and access to resources, such as food and mates. So disrupting key ecological processes that are important for survival. And so now we have all of this information. And for the last 20, 30 years, folks have really been working on solutions. And those solutions, as far as the impacts of roads go, have been creating wildlife over and underpass structures. In the last 5 to 10 years, so many of these projects we see mostly happening out west, starting to happen here in the east, but examples of true successes, not only funneling animals to potential crossings with fencing, but excluding the wildlife from the roadway. And so this is important, to reduce wildlife vehicle mortality, but also there's human safety issue involved here with our larger mammals. So we see the DOTs and wildlife agencies and groups like ours, non-for-profit organizations that do research and science, all coming together to try to reduce vehicle collisions for wildlife, but also increase human safety on the roadways as we're understanding this issue. And so, for example, in Wyoming around 2015, we hear about them putting in 6 wildlife underpasses and 2 wildlife overpasses in a critical migration area. And that increased wildlife connectivity, reducing pronghorn vehicle collisions by 100% and mule deer vehicle collisions by 78%. So we're just seeing, by collecting the information before and after, we're seeing these being implemented and big successes. One of my favorites examples is just in the last couple of years on Interstate 64 in Virginia. Researchers found that incorporating a mile of 8-foot fencing at 2 road structures that are already there, a box culvert and a river bridge, not specific for wildlife, by fencing and funneling animals to those and fencing them off the roadway, it reduced white-tailed deer collisions by 96% and 88% at these 2 structures.
Wow.
And so we're just seeing these big numbers, and through time, just a lot of positives that putting these structures on the landscape in the correct places are really successful for the connectivity aspect. So it's an exciting time, and, folks are seeing these projects out there. And so there's a lot of support and interest.
Is that why maybe, or one of the reasons why we're seeing more and more of these projects? Because that data on white-tailed deer collisions is a very just plain human safety issue. It just seems like highway departments and states and federal money would flow towards statistics like that without having to get into the weeds about all the great benefits. You don't have to sell them on all of the other things if that one economic and human safety issue is a driving factor behind money for these projects. Or am I reading that right?
No, it is us knowing more, and what it comes down to too is the economic cost of these vehicle collisions. There's been numbers crunched on how much it costs, statewide, looking at insurance costs, injuries to human life, and that's a huge figure as well. So I think it's an intersection of, yeah, a lot of times the policy or the funding that goes into these is maybe less focused on the connectivity, ecological aspect, but really on the human safety portion and economic cost. And so we're taking this opportunity to reconnect while there's kind of some synergy out there for multiple partnerships.
Well, that's about all of the administrative talk that my audience will tolerate. So we'll have to move on to the really fun stuff like connectivity stories. What kinds of things have you seen that really give you hope once things are in place and wildlife start using these crossings?
I'm excited when these projects, we see that they're planned for a specific wildlife, usually a large charismatic species, important usually for migration. They have these large home ranges, so they need a lot of resources. Habitat connectivity is important. But what I really like to see is when these go in and they actually help some of these smaller species where the roadways are true barriers. And so we see a connectivity of a diversity from, our smaller, lesser knowns, but true connectivity and ability for populations on both sides of major roadways to interact, disperse their genetics, really restore from being fragmented and isolated populations. So I like seeing the diversity of wildlife using these structures when they've just been pinpointed for maybe a white-tailed deer or a mule deer.
Yeah, the camera stuff is fascinating. I'm sure many of our listeners have tuned into a lot of those wildlife cams, and it really is exciting. And you can feel the excitement from people who are studying certain species or just general wildlife movements in recently reconnected areas, not just over or underpasses, but just connectivity in general. And the delight in their voices it's palpable. It's like, wow, look at that. Nobody would have expected. I think it was a wildlife crossing where we discovered the coyote and the badger working together. Are you familiar with that? I'm sure you are.
Yes. The safe passages, folks. Yes. What a gem. And we've had some of those too. I didn't want to jump the gun with the Pigeon River Gorge project, but I think my favorite crossing we saw there was an elevated metal culvert, right? We're in a steep, gorgy, mountainous terrain. And a lot of times the flow water under the interstate, it's a large metal pipe. And, sometimes these are bedded on the ground where animals could get in them. But this part of the culvert that we're focused on with a camera, we have both the entrance and exit. We see a female bobcat jump into the culvert, and you see her flag her tail and she is flagging her tail for her young kitten to come up. And her young kitten scrambles up there, and they pass safely under the interstate using a metal culvert to move water. It's exciting. And I mean, to add anecdotally, a project that I got to work on this summer, and we're just in the process of trying to finish up the project. We have a couple more months of monitoring. I have been so excited because we got an opportunity in Gorgeous State Park here in North Carolina. They put a couple small culverts under a road that they were building for a visitor center. And they were built for timber rattlesnakes in the area, important research in the area. Connectivity is important for basking sites, to natal dens, and this is just a hot spot for those animals. And they just, about 15 years ago, put in 3 I would say 2 by 2 foot concrete culverts under a not very used roadway. And I got the opportunity to monitor those this summer and warn my summer technician that I thought this could be really boring as we're just doing time-lapse photos and motion imagery. But we detected almost 20 different species of wildlife using these, from bobcats and red fox and gray fox to wood rats and bats and snakes, a diversity of snakes. So in general, and those have been out there for a while, it's just seemed really successful creating these paths of least resistance that provide some cover for wildlife to cross these roadways, no matter how big or small.
You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. From humble beginnings to global conservation phenomenon, the rewilding movement continues to grow and thrive amid the greatest ecological challenges our planet has faced in 65 million years. Here's how you can join us and help return balance to nature. First, go to rewilding.org and subscribe to the weekly digest to keep up on the latest rewilding news, interviews, and art. Second, consider donating to support the Rewilding Institute's mission to rewild North America and beyond. And for extra credit, please like, subscribe, and share this podcast to help spread the word. Thanks so much for your support.
So the Pigeon River Gorge project, let's talk about that. Give us an overview of what that is. I mean, this isn't just a wildlife crossing, it's a bunch of things. I mean, and culverts that even bats use. That's crazy. I had never heard that before.
Yeah, I think they might have been feeding in there on all of the insects in there. But so I think that's some of the bat use of that structure. But an important thing to mention when we talk about wildlife over and underpasses being placed on the landscape is road ecology research. So understanding wildlife along the roadway, their patterns and processes, that's road ecology research, and it is necessary to identify, the placement of these wildlife structures along a given stretch of highway. And so that's really the introduction to the Pigeon River Gorge project. Multiple agencies and non-for-profits came together and started talking in 2017 and 2018 about how this section of Interstate 40 that kind of runs along Great Smoky Mountain National Park. And then we have important national forest lands to the northeast. We're having a lot of bear mortality in the area. And our group, Wildlands Network, with the National Parks Conservation Association, the National Park Service, and the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission, all got together and started discussing, got funding, and decided we want to really focus some research to identify where these wildlife activity hotspots and mortality spots are along this roadway, so we could identify how to mitigate the effects of this road and put in solutions for increasing connectivity and also, again, that human safety issue. And for this project, we focused on black bear, white-tailed deer, and elk specifically.
So is there any way to describe the scope, either with the project you're working on now or with other things that you've studied, other areas, just how much wildlife we're talking about? This area of concern is of concern for a reason, and I imagine one of the main triggers was just all the mortality on the roadways. Just these things become apparent from DOT statistics in some ways, right? And
yes,
but like when you're talking about a complex of solutions, that will show up for all of this, what kind of size and scope are we talking about in terms of just wildlife numbers that are going to be protected and saved?
I think overall it's just hard to come up with a number here, because that same point, wildlife are being killed on the roadway, but how is it really influencing the populations that have been fragmented or isolated on a whole? So specific numbers, I don't have those, but I can say, we have this whole 28-mile span of roadway that we want to focus on, and we've got Great Smoky Mountains National Park, on one side, and one of the most ecologically diverse places in North America, in the world. And we have just as important large federal protected lands on the other side of this road. So the long-term effects, I think, are just greater than the numbers. But in the time, and this is why I don't have great numbers for you either, it's hard to get at how many animals are actually being killed along the roadway. One, they move, they don't stay there. And then the only information we tend to get as researchers are collision records from state troopers, from law enforcement, sometimes maintenance records from the DOT if they're moving carcasses. In our project, we did driving surveys just once a week. And so we're probably missing a lot of things, but in the 3 years that we did driving surveys, it was almost 100 bears killed in that time period.
Wow.
So it's hard to tell, and things fluctuate. We have high bear mortality years. They're very tied to the acorn mast here. So if we, and that's of course on a cycle, right, when those are produced. And so we do know, and we see more mortality in the gorge when we have low acorn years, because and this just signifies them moving to find resources, because they're scarce here. When they're moving to find resources, they're going to interact with more roads, and we're going to see more bear mortality.
To get really precise, in podcast world, the words ginormous and holy cow are also acceptable numbers and statistics.
Oh, I
And
appreciate that.
That's what I was getting at. I really start to get the sense that there's a lot more movement than people might think. And for all these reasons, the acorn thing is really interesting. It's just one example. Yeah, they have to move around. When there's a fire, I imagine, on one side or the other of a major thoroughfare, there's also another reason that you're going to see a lot of movement. What are some others that just to give people an idea of like all the different reasons wildlife does something it does not want to do? Yeah, on a loud, busy highway or underneath, or just experiencing that. I'm sure it's much more pleasant staying far away from that stuff for most wildlife.
I would imagine, I often put myself in that situation of thinking, animal behavior for wildlife biologists, animal behavior is so difficult to dissect and understand. It also tends to be very individualized from even animals within a species. But I've done a lot of wildlife work, and I worked along this roadside. We have wildlife cameras up, doing the surveys along the road, and the amount of noise generated from the roadway just got my nervous system going. The whole time I couldn't figure out why I was so nervous out there trying to concentrate to do things. And I just really imagine, like, these wildlife, I've got to think this is just one long giant monster with the amount of noise it generates. And what's difficult too out there is, the roadway runs between Knoxville and Asheville, that piece of roadway, and the increased traffic and semi-traffic. And then they put Jersey barriers in the middle so that traffic on either side doesn't run across. But that often is a 4 to 5 foot concrete barrier in the middle of the roadway.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about a bit of a wall. And so it was really, and how to create the road, blew up the mountain and built the road in there in what was once a pretty pristine area. So the implications are just kind of huge when we talk about just even simple connectivity efforts out there to get wildlife from the Smokies and from the forest lands back and forth.
I think a lot of people are familiar with video footage of bison and grizzlies and cubs sort of relatively lackadaisically crossing roads in national parks, and maybe have an idea that it's just that simple, that they can adapt and that it's not as stressful as it might seem. But most people also haven't sat next to a highway for as long as you have, with no motor running and not being inside a car, but fully exposed to all that stuff, that noise, that chaos. And so I'm glad you brought that up and described it, because most people are just passing through and they don't understand that there's a big difference for the wildlife. They really are solving a problem. Otherwise, they would not be there.
Exactly. Like, they need to get to that other side. And your question of why are, the bear example with the acorns is great, but then sometimes I don't have an example. In our research, we put GPS collars on 13 elk in the Smokies, and in the area, kind of the epicenter of elk activity in Great Smoky Mountain National Park is in the Cataloochee Valley, which is straight line distance, only about 6 kilometers to the interstate. And we put 13 collars on elk, and we track their movements. And while we only had one animal crossing the roadway in the 2 years we monitored, we had others that, you see the barrier effect. They come up to the roadway, they circle around it, they use the area on one side, they never cross. This one female, we actually monitored her for 3 years. She crossed the interstate 107 times. And every year it was the same pattern. In the early kind of springtime, she'd leave the Cataloochee Valley where the whole herd is. And she went on her own foray, and she was finding a place to have her calf. The cow elks go off, and when folks asked them, why over there? So she crossed the interstate at road grade. So at the road crossing, she had to navigate that. But she also used a bridge to move vehicles under the interstate, which is also where the Appalachian Trail crosses. It's right at the North Carolina, Tennessee border, and it's where the Appalachian Trail is. And we had some synergy in tracking her with our GPS collars, but then we're monitoring these structures with cameras, and you see her come back and bring her calf back to the valley using that bridge, and also crossing at road grade. So 3 years in a row, this animal left in the spring, had her calf, came back in early fall, bringing her calf with her. And I don't know how she's navigated to do this. I think in the first year, we thought she should have had a calf and she didn't, but hadn't monitored her yet. And then in the 3 years we did, she seemed to successfully do that. And I don't know why she wanted to be over there, but my simple answer is space. And we all need and want that, right?
Yeah. But we were just talking off mic about that at the beginning here, how much we both enjoy space, and people like us do. One can only imagine when you're born in that kind of space, how much you cherish it. And it's the only thing you pretty much primarily know. Yes, some of them seem braver than others. Some species do. There are some extraordinarily sensitive species. What kind of work have you been involved with or studied where the challenges are much, much greater? You sometimes can't just build it and they will come, is the case for some species, right?
Right. That is the case. And I think the focus there would be more on aquatic connectivity, something that gets a lot less, focus. And if we imagine here in the mountains or where we are now, where water is often needing to be conducted under roadways, well, that also fragments hydrological processes, but there's often step ups. These structures, these box culverts, these metal culverts, they often don't have a natural bottom. They create step ups. They don't have structure in them for fish species or aquatic species to be navigating or going through there. And so in some of our Pigeon River Gorge work, we've started talking to hydrologists and fish biologists who readily will tell you this is a huge, huge issue when you disconnect watersheds to their main source through creating roadways or other human development. There's a whole other diverse group of species in the aquatic realm that get little attention. And really spatially, sometimes these are smaller areas where there should really be a focus. And so I think that's a focus of road ecology and connectivity that's, trying to get the word out there. There's great projects being done, but I think to your audience and folks out there, aquatic connectivity is kind of huge.
Yeah, and even here, you and I have talked about the charismatic mega critters, and for the most part, until now, I'm very glad that you brought that up, because that usually does get glossed over, even in our company. Well, not when we're all just sitting around a campfire. We geek out on newts and everything else.
Exactly.
But, we're unusual, I think, in that respect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, us too. But we do latch on to these animals where we have, multiple partnerships and support, and can kind of drum up support for projects like this, and get a real commitment to trying to get mitigation on the ground to increase wildlife connectivity.
What is the big vision? What do you see in the future? Let's go 5 or 10 years down the road. What makes you really happy and hopeful about the work you're doing today and where it's leading?
Yeah. There is a lot of hope. So we have completed our research study. Now, the research itself got pretty large. So, you heard me mention GPS collared elk. We also had cameras monitoring along the roadside to look at animal activity. We monitored these culverts and bridges that currently exist to see if they're being used. And we compiled all this wildlife vehicle collision information. And we really divided the road into segments and, essentially ranked them to understand, where these high activity areas are, where animal activity is high, all to come up with, we have 20 recommendations within the gorge based on our research findings. And what that really looks like is we want a linkage system from one side to the other of the interstate, multiple opportunities for wildlife to cross under the roadway. And so what that looks like is we want to retrofit some existing structures. So culverts that are too small or where we see a lot of vehicle collisions, but there's an opportunity. We want to retrofit those. Maybe they need to be larger, less noisy, fencing to those. We also want a few dedicated wildlife overpasses in the region. That's kind of the big vision. Where we're seeing success and, important relationships is with our Department of Transportation partners. So early on in this research project, they reached out and told us 5 of the bridges you're monitoring in the Pigeon River Gorge on the North Carolina side are slated to be replaced. So they're going to be putting in all new structures. And at Wildlands Network, we saw this as an opportunity and came up with how, with the replacement of these structures that are already going to be there, we imagine they'll be there for another 60, 80 years. How could they incorporate wildlife passage into these structures? And so I'm really happy to say that first bridge that was slated for replacement, that we provided recommendations, a larger span so wildlife can have their own almost like greenway area to move through, and noise reduction, some fencing to guide to the structures and exclude from the roadway. Those have all been put in place in this first bridge replacement, which is the Harmon Den Bridge. And so that's just a huge win on our end. Shout out to our North Carolina Department of Transportation partners who really took our recommendations through a little relationship building and really thought we can do this and apply this. We want to see these benefits as well, not only for the safety issue, but we're all bought in and proud of the wildlife in our region. So it's been the community coming together on that level. So that would be the big win now. The research report itself, it just came out in July, and it really pinpoints with a lot of detail the areas and how. And we're proud of that. And that's where we're drumming up legislative support and funding. And, so there's this next phase of trying to get these implemented. We have such great research, due to having great partnerships and support. And now we're moving forward in the phase of let's get some of these implemented.
It feels like there's a groundswell, and there has been for a while, and it's been building, and it sounds like maybe you're kind of able to capitalize on that, having a receptive DOT. And, when in other areas, we are dealing with wildlife agencies that are not at all receptive to working with us or hearing from us or anything. It's just refreshing to hear any department of anything be receptive and want to team up on these things. Do you feel like there's a groundswell of support nationally for this?
Yeah, I really do. It's been a fun part of research to be involved with. And I mean, myself, getting to do research and taking it and being able to apply it on the ground for positive conservation outcomes. But while we're seeing the success of these, in the numbers I shared early on, I think the departments are too, and us being able to fill kind of a research gap. Folks are happy to provide resources, but maybe don't have the capacity. So I think being able to provide, this information gap through our research. But I think overall, it goes back to the real issues here beyond the mortality along the roadway. It's the larger connectivity. And I think if when Wildlands started in the early 90s, thinking large landscape connectivity, those were crazy. It was crazy to think on that scale. But we see that that's been fully adopted as well. And I think that understanding how important habitat connectivity is, everyone else is accepting that and realizing these roads are such an issue. And that human safety issue, again, it kind of is this synergistic effect. And beyond just it seeming that way, there's $350 million slated in the transportation bill for specific wildlife structures. So there's opportunities now in funding on this federal level. I think that's what we're seeing too. Is a more focus on that. Yeah. I think you're right about the groundswell. So it's definitely happening. I mean, even in, I'm not on social media too much, but I'm even seeing it a lot there, or people really seem to connect with it. I think the crossings themselves can be quite visionary, or they really inspire folks to think about a connected landscape, to see a bridge specific for wildlife. And I think that has a lot of hope in it. So I think that's what the appeal, that beyond that they seem to be really effective. They're kind of two birds with one stone. There's a lot going on there. So it's an exciting time. And it was so exciting to have such state agencies excited to work with us, and they've been supportive. So exciting stuff.
Stretches like the one you're working on that you did all this research on, there's a lot of those around the country that probably aren't getting the kind of attention that this stretch has, that still need a lot of supporters. So I would encourage everybody listening to find out about that in your area. And I would like to ask you, Liz, for people, first of all, in your area, in that area, is there anything that people can do that being geographically at hand might be helpful in support, or projects, or how would they even find out some pick and shovel things that they could do in the future when anything as simple as a culvert needs some support or help from volunteers, or anything digital or anything political that people can do to help and support this work?
Yeah, I think first and foremost for the project I've talked about is, so we have a website, smokysafepassage.org, and here you can get the latest. So where we're going to need a lot of folks' help is sending letters, contacting their legislative branches and offices to support work like this. But also, in the future, I imagine there are going to be apps and services that help others identify or mark where they're seeing roadkill. It's hard for me in this space to, I'd love for everyone to get out, and especially with the turtles and the amphibians and reptiles crossing the roadway, to drive slowly and move things. But that's also a danger to humans. But I think legislative support, sharing, that beyond the roadkill, the effects of these roads on wildlife, and those would be the general things. I think we do have a donation and support button for the Smoky Safe Passage Pigeon River Gorge project on this website, with some other, anecdotes on how you can help. But I think just having people recognize the issue, paying attention, and if you're seeing areas of high concentration of wildlife in your backyard, on your roads, get a hold of someone regionally or locally, or the wildlife agency. We know these places exist. And it's important to know too where the gaps in connectivity might be, or protected areas in your region too, just map wise, and understanding, if you're in a large public area and where we know there's a lot of wildlife diversity because of the habitat resources, and major roads are impacting those wildlife. I think, just trying to raise the red flag on the levels that you're comfortable with. I think just knowing the real issue.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, because I've been wanting to talk about this for a long time. And I feel like we got people caught up in a way that they're not getting in the, generic news. And you've been a great service to all of our listeners today. And thank you so, so much for all the work that you do and that you plan to continue to do for the wild and for connectivity.
Thanks so much, Jack. I appreciate the opportunity. I hope everyone enjoys this podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. We do what we do because of you. This podcast is supported by listeners like you who long to live in a wilder world. Please consider donating at rewilding.org and subscribe to our weekly news and article digest while you're there. To go the extra mile, you can follow and share Rewilding Earth on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Bonus points for sharing this podcast with your friends. To listen to past episodes, go to rewilding.org/pod. That's rewilding.org/pod.